The throne room of the Vithari Convergence smelled like burned copper and old authority. That was the first thing Callan Rowe noticed when the doors opened. That smell, like something enormous had been melting for 10,000 years, and had only recently decided to stop. The second thing he noticed was the silence. 60,000 beings, packed into tiered galleries that rose in concentric rings toward a ceiling lost in violet haze, and not one of them made a sound. He walked in anyway. His boots were wrong for the occasion. He knew that. They were work boots, the kind with polymer soles worn down on the left heel from years of favoring that side after the Dunbar Station injury. The Vithari envoy had offered him ceremonial footwear 3 times on the transit ship, and 3 times he'd declined. Not out of stubbornness, exactly. More because he'd learned a long time ago that you don't change your boots before a fight. You fight in what you came in. He was 41 years old and looked like it. There were scars across his jaw from the Meridian campaign. His left hand had 2 fingers that didn't bend all the way because of what had happened at Chelik IV. He hadn't combed his hair. He walked with the slightly forward lean of a man who spent his life moving toward things that were trying to kill him, and the lean had become permanent, like a tree grown sideways in the wind. The throne at the far end of the hall was not a chair. It was a structure, a living architectural mass of Vithari biostone that rose 15 meters and seemed to breathe, its surface shifting in slow, iridescent patterns the way oil moves on still water. Queen Vel-Sareth sat within it the way a jewel sits in a setting, or the way a spider sits at the center of something much larger than itself. She was beautiful by any standard that applied, and Callan was aware of this in the same way you become aware of the fact that a thing is very hot before you touch it, as information, not attraction. She had 7 arms, which the Vithari considered elegant, and a crown of bioluminescent filaments that rose from her skull like frozen electricity. Her eyes were the color of a gas giant's storm. She watched him walk the full length of that hall without blinking. None of her court blinked either. That was a Vithari thing. They considered blinking to be an expression of anxiety, and anxiety was for subjects, not royalty. Callan walked the full 400 meters to the foot of the throne. He did not bow, not because he was trying to make a point, but because it simply didn't occur to him as an available option. He stopped at the base of the steps and looked up. "Callan Rowe," the Queen said. Her voice came from multiple places at once, from her body, from resonator nodes in the walls, from something below the floor that he could feel in his back teeth. "Last Warden of the Home Sector, Commander of the Provisional Human Defense Compact. Survivor of Meridian Chelik IV, the Dunbar Station siege, the collapse of New Ankara, and 6 other engagements I will not list because we would be here until the star cools." She paused. "You have killed 11 Vithari field commanders." 12, Callan said. A sound moved through the 60,000. Not quite a gasp, more like a single, collective intake, 60,000 beings drawing breath at the same moment. The Queen looked at him for a long moment. Then, very slowly, the filaments on her crown shifted, brightening at the tips, a Vithari expression that the xenolinguistics team had spent 2 years trying to pin down, and had finally agreed meant something between amusement and respect, and the particular feeling you get when a thing you thought you understood reveals a new face. 12, she said. "My records are incomplete, I apologize." She did not sound like she was apologizing. "I have called you here," Vel-Sareth continued, "not to punish you, not to execute you, not to extract intelligence about your remaining forces or the disposition of what humans still call a fleet." She let that land for a moment. "I have called you here because the Vithari Convergence wishes to offer terms. And because I have found, in my study of your species, that you respond better to directness than to ritual. So I will be direct." She leaned forward in the biostone throne, and the entire structure moved with her, accommodating her the way a living thing accommodates another living thing. "You have fought us for 17 years. You have cost us more than any species we have encountered in 4,000 years of expansion. Not because your technology is superior, it is not. Not because your numbers are great, they were never great and now they are very small. But because of something we have studied and cannot fully quantify, which your psychologists call stubbornness, and which our analysts have taken to simply calling the Rho factor, after you specifically. Another pause. I wish to end this war. Callan waited. I'm prepared to offer you any prize in the galaxy, the Queen said. Name it. A world we have 12,000, a fleet we have fleets, political standing within the convergence, resources, technology that your people have not dreamed of, a title, land, anything that can be quantified and transferred I will give you. In exchange, the remaining human enclaves surrender their weapons, accept Vithari governance, and we proceed into a new era. She settled back. Or I can offer you something personal. Something for you specifically, not for your people. She glanced at her court, and the gesture was practiced. She had done this before in this room with other species, and it had always worked. I will offer you any companion you desire. Any female of any species within the convergence. I have seen the studies of human psychology, attachment, bonding. We understand what motivates individuals even when large-scale incentives fail. She spread 4 of her 7 hands in what was, for the Vithari, an expression of generosity. Name the one you want, Callan Rowe. Name her. We will find her for you. You will want for nothing. The silence in that hall was immense. 60,000 beings waited for the human to name his price. He took a long time, long enough that some in the upper galleries shifted on their perches, long enough that the Vithari protocol officer near the base of the stairs made a small anxious gesture that he wasn't supposed to make. Then Callan reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, the jacket that was also wrong for the occasion, being the same field jacket he'd worn for 3 campaigns, and he took out a small photograph. It was printed on actual paper, which was an extravagance he'd allowed himself exactly once in his life. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put it back. I don't think you understand what I want, he said. And then he told them. He told them about the home sector before the war. Not the strategic position of it, not the mineral value or the jump point access. The actual place. The way the secondary sun made the evenings on Home's world last 4 hours longer than anywhere else he'd ever been. So the light went through gold and amber and something darker, almost brown, before the stars came out. The way the soil in the agricultural valley smelled after rain, a particular kind of iron-rich smell that meant something was alive down there and working. The sound of the wind coming off the plateau at night, which was a low, even sound like a note held on a very large instrument. He told them about his father. His father, Iran Rowe, had been a frontier farmer, not a warrior, not a politician. A man who had spent 40 years coaxing crops from soil that barely wanted to give them up, on a world that barely wanted to be lived on, because someone had to do it, and Iran Rowe had decided that someone was him. He had a mechanical hauler, one of the old autonomous models, battered and slow, that he'd purchased secondhand and repaired so many times that the repair record was longer than the original specification manual. He used it every day. He talked to it, which everyone agreed was eccentric and no one could quite argue with, because the hauler had better reliability than any of the newer models, and Iran maintained it was because the machine had been spoken to kindly. The court was very quiet. They had expected demands. They had expected negotiation. They had not expected this. Callan told them about the day the first Vithari ships appeared over Home's world. He had been 19. He was working in the east fields with the hauler when the sky changed, when the light shifted wrong, the way light shifts when something vast comes between a world and its sun. He remembered looking up and feeling not fear, not immediately, but the particular vertigo of a moment when the world you understood reveals itself to be a smaller world nested inside a larger one that operates by different rules. He remembered his father standing next to him, one hand on the hauler's chassis, looking up. What he remembered most was that his father didn't run. Iran Rowe stood in his field, on his soil, With his hand on the machine he'd talked to and repaired and kept running for 40 years. And he did not run. He looked at the ships the way he'd looked at a bad harvest season, or a failing water pump, or the death of his wife 10 years earlier, with the particular stillness of a man who has made peace with the fact that the world does not ask permission before it becomes hard. He said one thing, Callan told the throne room. He said, "Well, we'd better figure out what they want." And then the bombardment started. The Queen had not moved. None of her court had moved. Something had changed in the room that was hard to locate. A quality of attention, perhaps, that was different from the attention that greets entertainment or the attention that greets a threat. Iran Rowe died in the first hour of the home bombardment. The eastern fields burned. The hauler, being autonomous and having sustained damage to its navigation systems, walked itself in a wide circle for 6 hours before its power cells gave out, and Callan found it 3 days later, cooled and still, standing in the field it had always worked, because it didn't know where else to go. He told them that too. He told them about the years after, about the refugee ships and the committee meetings and the 17 different defense plans that each assumed the Vithari would behave like something human, which they did not. About the losses, the names. He didn't give statistics. He gave names, individual names, because he had made himself memorize them, and he was not going to stop naming them in front of an audience just because the audience was the entity responsible. Sable Mura, Tam Korsh, the Diallo sisters, both of them in the same engagement on the same ship, 40 minutes apart. Captain Yusra Aldani, who had been a schoolteacher before the war and taught herself orbital mechanics from repair manuals because no one who had actually trained for it was left. Decker Frome. The 312 people at Dunbar Station. He spoke for 11 minutes. The Vithari court record would later show this precisely. 11 minutes and 4 seconds, which was longer than any supplicant had ever spoken in that room without being interrupted. Then he said, "You want to know what I want? I'll tell you. I want the eastern fields. I want them restored, the soil, the watershed, the atmospheric scrubbers my father installed when the acid rain started getting bad. I want a marker placed where the hauler stopped walking, because that's where my father's land ends and something else begins, and I want it marked. I want the Vithari construction guilds to build back what was burned in the first bombardment, using Vithari biorestoration tech, because I know you have it and I know it works faster than anything we had." He looked directly at the Queen. "And I want 17 years acknowledged, not apologized for, acknowledged. There's a difference. An apology is a thing you say. Acknowledgement means the record contains what actually happened, accurately, permanently, where anyone can read it." Another pause. "That's what I want. Not a woman, not a fleet, not a title, the land, the record, and enough time to grow something in the soil before I die." The silence this time was different. It was not the silence of shock or offense. It was the silence of 60,000 beings, recalibrating what they thought they understood about a species they had been fighting for 17 years. Queen Velsareth looked at him for a long time. When she finally spoke, she said, "You could have had anything. I know. You chose a farm. I chose what was taken." She considered this. The biostone throne shifted almost imperceptibly around her. "Most species who reach this room," she said, "in this position ask for survival, power, safety, the continuation of their genetic line, the perpetuation of their culture. These are quantifiable, these we can negotiate." She paused. "You have asked for a specific piece of ground and a historical record." "Yes." "Why does the record matter as much as the land?" He thought about it. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to give her the real one, not the convenient one. "Because the land can be taken again," he said finally. "Records are harder to burn." What happened next would be debated in Vithari academic circles for generations. The Queen made a gesture that none of her court had seen her make in public before. She pressed 2 of her 7 hands together at the wrist, which was a Vithari gesture so intimate it was usually only exchanged between members of the same breeding family. It meant, approximately, "I see the shape of you clearly." She said, "We will discuss terms." He said, "I know you will." But that is where the story ends if you tell it quickly, and the quick version is not the true one. The true one starts 11 years before that throne room, on a refugee transport called the Persistent Question, and it starts with a teenage boy named Jerome Rowe who had just watched his father die, and was trying to keep a broken mechanical hauler's power cells charged with equipment salvaged from the ship's water filtration system, because the hauler was the last thing his father had touched, and he was not ready to let go of it yet. Jerome was 16 when the evacuation left home's world. He was the kind of boy who was always watching, always slightly to the side of where the action was, eyes moving, cataloging. He had his father's stillness and his mother's precision, which was a useful combination in a war and a difficult one in a childhood. He had a scar above his left ear from the first bombardment, where a piece of the hauler's outer casing had caught him when the shockwave hit. He told people it was from something more interesting, which was the first lie he ever told, and he stopped telling it after a year because he decided his father would not have approved. He and his older brother Callan were the only Rows who made it off the planet. On the transport, there was a woman named Sable Mura who was trying to organize the refugees, not because anyone had appointed her, because someone had to, and she was the one willing to do it. She was 43 and had been the Water Resources Administrator for the Home Settlement's Eastern District, which meant she had spent her career in the particular form of warfare that is trying to make sure people have enough water, and she had developed a combative serenity about it, the kind that comes from fighting a battle that has no clean victory condition. She fed 312 people on a ship rated for 200, by the simple method of refusing to accept that it wasn't possible. Jerome watched how she did it, not the logistics, the psychology, how she talked to people, how she made them feel like the emergency was a problem to be solved rather than a catastrophe to be endured. She didn't minimize what was happening. She didn't pretend things were fine. She said, "Here is where we are, here is what we need, here is what you specifically can do," and people did it. He asked her once how she knew what to ask people to do. She said, "You watch them. You figure out what they're good at before they remember they're scared. Then you ask for that thing." He didn't forget that. Callan was 22 on the transport and already not sleeping. Jerome could tell because Callan had always gone still when he slept, and he wasn't going still anymore. He was always moving, even in rest, working through something, turning something over. He was in the planning meetings with the other survivors who had military experience, which was not much military experience, because Holmes' world had not had a lot of call for it before. They were making it up as they went. Jerome sat outside those meetings and listened through the bulkhead, not because anyone excluded him, but because he could hear better through the metal than he could through the door, and the information was cleaner that way. He heard his brother say once, in a voice that was very quiet but not quiet enough, "If I'd been faster." And he heard Sable Mura say just as quietly, "You can't be faster than a bombardment. Stop asking that question. Start asking what you do now." Jerome filed that away too. The hauler was in the cargo bay on the lower deck, wedged between a crate of soil samples that someone had grabbed as they ran. A scientist, probably. Someone who couldn't leave without taking one last piece of the thing they'd spent their life studying. And 3 containers of water processing equipment that Sable had insisted on bringing, because she'd done the math on the transport's existing systems and decided they wouldn't last a long journey. The hauler had taken shrapnel damage to its left tread assembly and its navigation array, which meant it could move but not in a straight line, and it couldn't process where it was relative to where it wanted to go. Without external direction, it just stood in the cargo bay, inert, waiting. Jerome spent the first week on the transport learning how the hauler thought. He had the original maintenance logs, because his father had kept them on a physical drive that was still plugged into the hauler's chassis when they loaded it. The logs went back 22 years. Iran had written them in his own hand, which for a farmer on a frontier world meant they were practical and short and very specific about what had been done and why. Jerome read them all. He read the notes about the tread replacements and the sensor recalibrations, and the time the navigation system had developed a recursive error that made the hauler walk the same 40-meter loop for a day and a half before Iran figured out what was wrong. He read the note his father had written the day he bought the machine, paid too much, will be worth it. He read the last entry, written 6 months before the bombardment, left tread is pulling. Think it's the articulation joint. We'll look at it this weekend. He looked at it that weekend. The articulation joint on the left tread assembly. He fixed it with parts he found in the cargo bay's tool locker. It took him 11 hours. When the tread worked correctly again, the hauler's navigation system, which had been getting confused by the uneven pull, recalibrated. It found the cargo bay. It found the ship's internal coordinate system, which was something it was not designed to do. But the hauler's AI was old and creative in the way that things get creative when they've been repaired enough times that the original logic has been substantially replaced by workarounds. It began, in the slow, patient way of autonomous machines, to learn the ship. Jerome watched it do this. He was 16 years old and the world he was born on was ash and his father was dead, and his brother was in meetings every night trying to invent a war, and Jerome sat in the cargo bay and watched the hauler learn the ship's corridors and felt, for the first time since the evacuation, something that was not grief. He couldn't name it then. Later he would name it. It was the feeling of watching a thing be exactly what it was made to be, doing it against odds, in circumstances that had not been planned for. He recognized it because his father had had it. That quality of pressing on. He started talking to the hauler because his father had. The war started in pieces the way wars do. There was no declaration. The Vithari did not declare things, they stated them, and the statement was the bombardment. There were 7 settled human worlds in the home sector at the time of the expansion, plus 11 stations and 2 orbital manufacturing platforms. By the end of the first year, the count was 3 worlds, 4 stations, 1 platform. The humans who survived the first year survived because of things that the Vithari had not predicted. Small things. The fact that human maintenance crews could repair damage to jump drives while the ship was still in motion, because they'd been doing that in civilian shipping for decades, and the technique wasn't in any military manual, but everyone who'd worked a cargo run knew it. The fact that a certain type of Vithari sensor array had a 30-second recalibration lag after a particular electromagnetic signature, and a human engineer named Decker Frome noticed this in captured footage from a battle that the humans had lost and went through it frame by frame for 3 weeks until he understood it, and then told Callan. And then Callan built a tactic around it that worked 4 times before the Vithari adjusted. Small things, human things, the texture of a species that had been improvising under pressure for as long as it could remember and had gotten very good at it. The Vithari had been expanding for 4,000 years. They had encountered 31 species with spaceflight capability. Of those 31, 28 had negotiated terms of integration within the first decade of contact. 2 had fought and lost within a generation. 1 had simply ceased to exist in the contact period, not from violence but from a kind of social dissolution that the Vithari records described in language that was almost apologetic in its clinical precision. Humanity was species 32. The Vithari planners had assigned it an integration timeline of 6 to 8 years, based on modeling that accounted for human population size, technology level, political fragmentation, and historical conflict patterns. The model was built on 4,000 years of accurate predictions. It was wrong. What the model did not account for, what no 4,000-year model had needed to account for before, was the specific human capacity for improvisation under resource scarcity. The Vithari had always defeated resistance by controlling resources. Cut off the fuel, the food, the water, the rare materials needed for advanced technology, and the resistance collapsed because the resistance could not maintain itself. It was a clean and reliable method that had worked on every species they had ever encountered. The humans did not stop when their resources were cut. They found other resources. They used things the Vithari had not considered resources. They recycled. They repurposed. They jury-rigged. They ran ships on power systems that Vithari engineering assessments described as impossible meaning, we have no model for how this can function, but it clearly is functioning. They fed populations on ration systems the Vithari nutritional models said were insufficient. The populations were hungry and they were not happy and they kept going. The Vithari High Command, in a classified assessment in Year 3, described this as a calibration problem. They were not wrong. The calibration problem was that they were trying to measure humanity against all prior species, and humanity was not like all prior species. Humanity was like nothing they had encountered before, and the encounter had therefore produced something that had not occurred in 4,000 years of expansion. Genuine surprise. Jerome spent the first 3 years of the war learning how to fly, how to fight, and how to read Vithari tactical language from intercepted communications. He had a gift for the language that the analysts said was unusual, not because the language was simple, it was not, but because he had his mother's ear for pattern, and Vithari tactical language was almost entirely pattern, being a species that had fought the same way for 4,000 years and had never had strong reason to change. The reason they hadn't changed was that it had always worked, until the humans. In Year 2, Jerome translated an intercepted tactical communication that described, in clinical Vithari administrative language, the disposition of what remained of Holmes' world. The bombardment had been followed by a resource extraction operation, which was standard Vithari post-conflict procedure. The soil had been analyzed and found mineral-rich. The atmospheric processors his father had installed were being repurposed for Vithari industrial use. The eastern fields had been converted to a staging area for extraction equipment. He read this 3 times. Then he put the tablet down and sat very still for a while. Then he went back to work. He didn't tell Callan. His brother was carrying enough. Callan was 25 years old and had the look, Jerome had seen it develop over the 2 years since the evacuation, of a man who had taken on weight that had no name yet. Not grief exactly. Not anger. Something more structural, like a building settling into new foundations. Callan had become the thing that kept others moving, and Jerome understood without being told that the thing keeping others moving did not get to stop and feel the weight. Not in public. Not yet. So Jerome kept the translation to himself and put the feeling somewhere useful. He filed it under, "This is what it is, now what do you do?" That was his father talking. He recognized it as such and kept it. Callan was 25, the first time he killed a Vithari field commander. He was on the bridge of a repurposed cargo hauler that had been converted to a combat vessel by the simple method of welding weapon mounts to the hull and hoping they held, which they had, barely, twice. The Vithari field commander was aboard a warship that outmassed the cargo hauler by a factor of 40. Callan flew the cargo hauler directly at the warship's sensor array, which everyone on the bridge understood was suicidal, and which everyone did anyway, because Callan was calm about it and calm is contagious. And at the moment the Vithari sensor array went through its 30-second recalibration cycle, he fired everything the cargo hauler had, which was not much, but which was precisely targeted using data that Jerome had provided from the intercepted communications. And the warship's drive system took damage that Vithari engineering had never anticipated, because no ship had ever attacked from that angle before. The field commander's vessel limped to a station for repairs and was therefore not present at the engagement that followed, which the humans won. Callan did not celebrate. He didn't permit celebrations. He said, "The next one will have adjusted." He was right. He was usually right, which was useful and occasionally exhausting. He was also, Jerome had come to understand, usually right in the specific way that their father had been usually right, not by seeing more than other people, but by being willing to look at what was actually there rather than what they wanted to see. There was a battle the fourth year, the engagement the humans called Chelik IV, for the world that burned during it, where Callan's command ship was hit 3 times and should have been destroyed, and wasn't, because the damage control crew sealed compartments with a technique from an agricultural machinery manual that Jerome had found in salvage and passed on to his brother, and the technique worked, and Callan lived. He lost 2 fingers of his left hand in that engagement and didn't mention it to Jerome until 2 weeks later, in the same flat tone of voice their father used when he described a setback in the fields. "This thing happened. We go on." Jerome flew 9 combat missions in year 4. He was shot down twice. He survived both times by doing things that were not in any manual, because the manual hadn't anticipated his specific situation, and he had his father's quality, the stillness, the looking at what is, the refusal to require the problem to be a different problem than it actually was. He was 20 when he shot down his first Vithari warship. He was 22 when he stopped counting. In year 6 of the war, something happened that Jerome had not anticipated, which was that he began to understand the Vithari. Not sympathize, he was not ready for that, and would not be for years, and even then would never be entirely certain what the word meant when applied to beings who had burned his world. But understand. The intercepted communications had given him the language, and through the language came the shape of the thinking, and the shape of the thinking was surprising. Not evil, not callous, just very, very different. The Vithari experienced expansion as obligation, not conquest. They had a concept. Jerome spent 6 months working out an adequate translation that combined the English ideas of stewardship and inevitability, and something closer to the feeling you get when you tidy a space that has been left in disorder. The expansion was, to them, the act of bringing order to a disordered region of space. The integration of other species was, to them, the generous offer of inclusion in a better system. They genuinely did not understand why humanity would refuse this. Jerome sat with that for a long time. He wrote a long analysis, 80 pages, which he sent to Callan and which Callan read in one sitting, and then didn't speak for an hour. The analysis argued that the Vithari were not going to stop, because they were not capable of conceiving the war as anything other than a temporary disorder to be corrected. That the human resistance, from the Vithari perspective, was not a military problem but an administrative one, a region of space with a malfunctioning integration process that would eventually be resolved by sufficient application of corrective resources. That this meant they would keep coming, not with hatred or malice, with patience and administrative thoroughness and the absolute confidence of beings who had never been wrong before. It also argued, and this was the part that Callan had sat with for an hour, that this could be used. Because beings who experience war as an administrative problem do not adapt the way beings who experience war as survival adapt. They have processes. The processes have been refined over 4,000 years to be very good at the problems they were designed for. They had never been designed for humanity specifically, because humanity was a problem they had not encountered before, which meant every time humanity did something outside the process had to be updated. And updates took time, and in that time the humans were doing something else outside the process. He titled the analysis, "The Time Between Updates." He was 22 years old. Callan read it and then called him and said, simply, "You understand them better than anyone else we have." Jerome said, "I know. That's going to be important." "I know that too." There was a pause. Then Callan said, in the voice he only used when something cost him, "Dad would have had questions about this analysis. He'd have sat at the table with it and his coffee and asked the things that poke holes. Jerome thought about it. What questions? He'd have asked whether understanding them changes anything about what has to happen. Jerome had already thought about that. No, he said, but it changes how. Callan said, yeah, a pause, good work. He said it the way their father had said it to the hauler. Jerome didn't point that out. It didn't need pointing out. The war was 17 years of small choices made under pressure by people who did not have the option of making large ones. It was Yusra Aldani teaching herself orbital mechanics from repair manuals, and then teaching 12 other people who then taught 12 more. It was Decker Frome going through battle footage frame by frame until he found the thing everyone else had missed. It was Sable Mura feeding 312 people on a ship rated for 200, because she had decided it was possible and then figured out how. It was Jerome doing the same work in a different form, learning the language of his enemy not to understand them, but to read them the way you read a machine, looking for the lag, the recalibration cycle, the moment between moments when something is briefly vulnerable. And it was Callan Rowe, every time choosing to staying on the line when better strategic minds argued for retreat, staying in the sector when the central human government, such as it was, argued that the home sector was indefensible and the resources should go elsewhere, staying with the plan when the plan seemed wrong but changing it required more time than they had, not out of stubbornness, exactly. More out of a belief he'd inherited from his father and never examined closely enough to question, which was, the land is worth staying for, and if enough people believe that, then it is. The belief was not strategically sound. He knew that. The analysts told him at least once a year, with varying degrees of frustration. The home sector had already been substantially destroyed. Staying to defend what remained was, from a resource optimization standpoint, irrational. The resources committed to defending the home sector could make a greater statistical difference elsewhere. He heard that argument. He did not change his position. Not because the argument was wrong, but because there are things that are not about optimization, and he had spent enough time in the war to know which things those were. The eastern fields were those things. The ground where his father had stood, not running hand on the hauler, watching the ships come, that was that kind of thing. You do not optimize around that kind of thing. You hold it. In year 9, Callan made a decision that the military historians would later spend a great deal of time arguing about. The Vithari had a forward command installation on the moon of a planet called Veth, which was close enough to the home sector that it was clearly intended as a staging platform for the next phase of the push. Taking it out was an obvious move, which meant the Vithari had obvious defenses around it, which meant it wasn't a viable target under any conventional analysis. Callan attacked it anyway. Not with ships, with the hauler. The original mechanical hauler, the one that had been Iran Rose, the one Jerome had kept running on the refugee transport with water filtration parts, the one they'd carried with them for 9 years, because neither of them had been able to decide to leave it behind, had been modified over those 9 years in ways that were not sanctioned by the manufacturer. Jerome had spent a great deal of his spare time on it. He had, among other things, repaired its laser sensor array, which had been damaged in the original bombardment, and in doing so had discovered that the sensor array could do something that was not in the original specification. It could, under specific conditions that he had spent 3 years creating the conditions for, emit a coherent electromagnetic pulse on a frequency that matched, almost exactly, the recalibration cycle of the Vithari sensor, arrays that Decker Frome had identified 9 years earlier. He had discovered this the way he discovered most things, by accident while trying to fix something else, and then by paying very close attention to the accident. The sensor array modification had started as an attempt to fix a persistent calibration error, that made the hauler occasionally believe it was somewhere it wasn't. Jerome had replaced the primary sensor emitter, then the calibration processor, then the signal buffer, and at each stage had tested with the diagnostic equipment they had on hand, which was not the equipment specified in the manual, but equipment Jerome had adapted from other sources because the specified equipment was not available. One of the adapted diagnostic tools emitted a signal on a frequency Jerome had not thought to check, and the hauler's sensor array, rather than being confused by it, had absorbed it and done something unexpected. It had reflected it back, modified, at a frequency Jerome recognized from Decker-Fromm's analysis of the Vithari sensor lag. He ran the test 17 times. Then he sat on the cargo bay floor next to the hauler and worked through the implications for 6 hours. Then he went to Callan's office and explained it. Callan listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When Jerome finished, Callan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The hauler." "Yes." "Dad's hauler." "Yes." Callan looked at him for a long time. "Will it work?" "Yes, once." "They'll adjust." "Will they adjust fast enough to matter?" Jerome thought about it. "No, not if we pick the right target." They picked the Veth installation. It was the right target. Jerome flew it in himself. He was 30 years old and his hands were completely steady. He landed in the maintenance bay and walked out of it and kept walking, and 40 seconds later the pulse fired, and the sensor array across the entire Vithari installation went through its 30-second recalibration cycle simultaneously, and Callan's ships were inside the perimeter before the cycle completed. They took the installation in 4 hours. After walking back through what was left of it, Jerome found the hauler where he'd parked it, undamaged, still running. It had, apparently, as part of its default protocol after completing a task, entered a waiting state, which meant it was just standing there in the maintenance bay, patient, in the middle of the smoking wreckage, waiting to be needed. He stood next to it for a while. He put his hand on its chassis, the way his father used to. Then he said, "Good work," which was the kind of thing that was eccentric to say to a machine, and which no one there was going to argue with, because the machine had just turned the tide of a 9-year war, and if Jerome Rowe wanted to compliment it, that was between him and the machine. The Vithari High Command's analysis of the Veth operation would note, in its aftermath assessment, that the installation had been taken using a device that was, technically, a commercial agricultural hauler manufactured 30 years prior, in a design so outdated it wasn't produced anymore, running on jury-rigged power cells, and a sensor array modification that shouldn't have been physically possible under the laws governing Vithari field technology. The assessment would also note, in what would become the most cited sentence in 4,000 years of Vithari military records, that the device appeared to have been kept operational by sentiment. The analyst who wrote that sentence had intended it as a description of a technical anomaly, not as a philosophical observation. The Vithari Convergent Science Council would later disagree, and would spend several decades arguing about whether sentiment constituted a resource that should be incorporated into future conflict modeling. They had not resolved this question when the war ended. They had also, by the time of its ending, stopped being entirely sure they wanted to. 4 years after the Veth installation fell, the Vithari Queen sent a message to the human command requesting what she called a consultation. The message was in human standard, which was already unusual, and was phrased not as a demand but as a request, which was something the Vithari had not done with a non-member species in anyone's recorded memory. Callan's advisors spent 3 weeks arguing about whether to go. The arguments against were reasonable. The arguments for were simpler. This is what we have been trying to achieve. If it is a trap, at least we can see what kind of trap it is. He went. He asked Jerome to come. Jerome said no, that Callan was better at this, that Jerome was better at the other kind of work. Callan said he'd be back. Jerome said he knew. Then Jerome went back to the hauler, which was in a bay on the station they were operating from, and started working on something new he'd found in an old specification manual that he thought might be worth understanding. In the throne room, walking those 400 meters, Callan thought about the hauler standing in the field after the power cells gave out. He thought about his father's hand on the chassis. He thought about Sable Mura feeding 312 people because she'd decided it was possible. He thought about Yusra Aldani learning orbital mechanics from repair manuals. He thought about Jerome's steady hands on the controls. He thought about Decker Frome going through footage frame by frame for 3 weeks until he found it. He thought about all of them, the ones who were still alive and the ones who weren't, and felt not pride exactly, but something like what you feel when you look at a thing that has been built from difficult materials, carefully, over a long time, by people who knew what they were doing. He thought this is what we are, not the victories, this. When the Queen finished her offer, the worlds, the fleets, the companion, anything he wanted, he reached into his jacket and he took out the photograph. He looked at it for a moment. It was a photograph of the eastern fields of Holmes' world, taken in the long evening light when the secondary sun made everything amber-brown. It showed a mechanical hauler moving slowly through the rows, and a figure walking beside it with one hand on the chassis. He put the photograph back. He started talking. The record of the Vithari Convergence's negotiation with the Provisional Human Defense Compact would later note that the consultation lasted 3 days, and that the terms agreed upon were unusual by any precedent in Vithari diplomatic history. The humans did not receive a world. They received their world, specifically, a binding restoration commitment for the home sector worlds that had been bombarded, using Vithari biorestoration technology under human oversight. They received an acknowledgement, permanent and publicly held, of the scope and nature of the 17-year conflict. They received trade terms that the economic analysts described as generous, and that the political analysts described as the kind of thing you offer when you have decided you want a particular relationship with a particular people for a very long time. They did not receive a fleet. They did not receive a title. The companion offer was declined without elaboration, and no one in the court asked for the elaboration. What the Queen received in exchange was something that no Vithari acquisition record had ever contained before. She received a cessation of the thing that her analysts had called, after considerable study, the Rho factor. She received the agreement of the one person her models indicated was the load-bearing point of the entire human resistance effort, not because he was the strongest or the most brilliant or the most ruthless, but because he was the most convinced, and conviction, her analysts had determined, was the fuel that all the rest ran on. She also received, she told her court afterward, something she had not expected to receive. She received an education. They are unlike anything we have encountered, she told the council, in the closed session that followed. Not because they are strong, not because their technology is advanced, but because they cannot be made to want the wrong things. You can offer them everything. You can threaten them with everything. They already know what they want, and what they want is not what you think. It is not survival or dominance or safety or glory. It is, she paused. She made the gesture again, the one with 2 hands pressed at the wrist. It is the particular, specific thing that was theirs, and they will burn the galaxy to get it back. A counselor asked, "Is that a strength or a weakness?" She said, "Yes." Jerome Rowe did not attend the treaty signing. He was, on the day it happened, on a restoration shuttle over Holmes' world, monitoring the first phase of the biorestoration process. He had a tablet in his hands with the spectral analysis of the soil in the eastern fields, which was beginning to show, very faintly, the chemical signatures that meant something was alive down there and working. He had the hauler with him. He'd put it in cargo because it seemed wrong to leave it behind. He had been thinking on the transit about his father's maintenance logs, About the last entry, left tread is pulling. Think it's the articulation joint. We'll look at it this weekend. The articulation joint was fine now. Had been fine for 25 years, because Jerome had fixed it on a refugee transport when he was 16 years old with parts from a water filtration system, and had kept it fine, and would keep it fine for as long as there was something to keep fine. He thought about that, about the specific act of maintenance, the particular commitment of keeping a thing running not because it was strategic or optimal, but because it was your father's and your father had kept it running. And some things you continue not because the logic demands it, but because you are the kind of person who continues. He thought about what Callan had said after reading the 80-page analysis, after the silence that lasted an hour. You understand them better than anyone else we have. He thought, I understand us better. That's what I was doing, understanding us. The Vithari language was just the instrument. What he understood, what the analysis had been moving toward without quite arriving at, because you can write 80 pages about a thing and still only be circling what you actually know, was this. Humanity's power was not in any specific quality. Not stubbornness alone, not ingenuity alone, not adaptability alone. It was in the refusal to separate these things from what they were for. Humans were stubborn about specific things, the particular, named, irreplaceable things, and the stubbornness had its shape from those things the same way a river has its shape from the valley it runs through. Take away the valley, and the river is just water going somewhere. What the Vithari had never understood, and what the Queen was beginning to understand now, was that you could not deprive humanity of its will by taking its resources. The resources were downstream. What was upstream? What fed everything else was the particular, named, irreplaceable thing that a man's father had touched, and the decision that it was worth going back for. You could not offer a replacement for that thing. It did not have a replacement. It was itself and nothing else, and it was worth the cost of the war to hold. When the shuttle's communication system chimed with the treaty confirmation, a short tone, unambiguous, Jerome looked out the viewport at the world below. The secondary sun was coming around. Even from orbit, the evening light had that quality amber, then something darker than the stars. He put his hand flat on the viewport glass. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just held his hand there, against the warmth of the light coming off the world that was starting to come back, and stayed like that for a while. In the bay below, the hauler sat in its waiting state, patient, in the particular stillness of things that have been maintained with enough care that they simply continue. Outside, Holmes' world caught the light and held it. The soil was already beginning, in its slow chemical way, to remember what it was for. And somewhere in the eastern fields, where the marker would be placed, where the hauler had stopped walking when the power gave out, because it didn't know where else to go, the iron-rich ground was doing what ground does when someone has been tending it for a long time. It was keeping and waiting and holding the shape of what it had been given, patient as stone, ready to give something back. There are things that happen in wars that the histories don't record, because they don't have the shape of history. They are too small or too specific, or they require too much context to explain, or the people they happen to are not the people the histories are about. But they happen, and the people they happen to carry them, and sometimes the carrying is the thing that makes everything else possible. Callan carried the night after Dunbar Station. He had not spoken about it to Jerome or to anyone in the 12 years since. The station had been a command post, a repair facility, a processing hub for 312 people who had been making the war function at a level that didn't appear in tactical assessments because it was the level below tactics, the level of, the ship's water recycler is failing, find me the part, the jump drive needs recalibration before it shreds itself, the medical supply situation is critical in the northern corridor. 312 people doing the work that kept the doing of work possible. The Vithari had not been targeting the station strategically. The assessment afterward, Jerome's assessment, because Jerome was the one who read their internal communications, showed that the Vithari had not even known, specifically, what Dunbar Station was. They had identified it as a human installation with active power signatures in a corridor they were clearing. Clearing meant exactly what it sounded like. The station was cleared. Callan had been 12 hours away when it happened. He arrived to debris. He spent 4 hours going through it with the 2 other ships he had, looking for survivors. There were none. He catalogued what he found. He did not speak during this process. He transmitted a report afterward that was accurate and thorough, and contained nothing of what the station had actually been, nothing of the 312 people, and the specific jobs they had done, and the specific things each of them had been keeping alive by doing those jobs. Jerome read the report and understood what it didn't contain. He wrote a separate document, not a strategic assessment, just a list. 312 names, with a note beside each about what that person had done and what broke when they were gone. He sent it to Callan with no message attached. Callan sent back a single line, "I know all of them." Jerome sent back, "I know you do." They didn't speak about it again. They didn't need to. The knowledge was there between them, the way their father had always been between them, not as a ghost or a grief, but as a fact about what things were worth, and why you did not put them down. In year 12 of the war, a Vithari diplomatic sub-commander named Ev Varath requested a communication with the human command. Not Queen Vel-Sarath. The Queen communicated through channels and through subordinates, and through the elaborate protocol structures that Vithari governance required. This was a sub-commander, which in Vithari hierarchy was roughly equivalent to a senior military official with independent operational authority, and the request was direct and informal by Vithari standards, which meant it arrived as a communication rather than a formal petition. Jerome read it first, because all intercepted Vithari communications came to him first. It wasn't intercepted. It was addressed to him personally, by name, with a translation note at the bottom that indicated the author had written it in human standard rather than Vithari tactical language, because the note read, in careful standard, "I want to be certain my meaning is accurate, and I believe my standard is better than your Vithari." The communication was, as best as Jerome could determine, the closest thing the Vithari had to an unofficial approach. It said, "I have read your analysis. The 80-page document that humans call the time between updates, which has been circulating in our command structure in a redacted form that I managed to obtain in full. I would like to discuss it." Jerome stared at that for a long time. Then he showed it to Callan. Callan read it and was quiet for a moment and then said, "What do you think?" Jerome said, "I think it's genuine." "Why?" "Because the translation is too good to be casual and too uncertain to be official. He actually read it. He actually thought about it. He's not running a protocol, he's trying to have a conversation." Callan considered this. Is that more dangerous or less dangerous? Jerome thought about it. "I don't know, but it's more interesting." They talked to Ev Varath. Callan set the terms. Encrypted channel, human-side verification, Jerome conducting the communication with Callan present. Ev Varath agreed to all of it immediately, which was the first of several moments in the conversation that would catch Jerome off guard. The conversation lasted 6 hours. Ev Varath was a being who had been part of the expansion operation for what in Vithari lifespan terms was a relatively short time, 30 years, and who had therefore been present for, specifically, the human encounter. He had been in the command structure for the Chelik IV engagement. He had been part of the team that analyzed the Veth operation. He had read the time between updates in full, and had, apparently, found it disturbing in a way he was not entirely able to articulate in either language. What he said, after 6 hours, in the careful human standard he had been practicing, was, "We did not know you were like this." Jerome said, "What did you think we were?" "A calibration problem," Ivvareth said, and then after a pause, "I apologize for that." Jerome said, "You can't be faster than a bombardment." He wasn't sure in the moment why he said it. Later he understood. It was Sable Mura's voice in his head from the transport from the night Callan had said if I'd been faster. The same principle. You can't change what already happened. Start with where you are. Ivvareth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does that mean?" Jerome explained. He told the Vithari sub-commander about the transport, about Sable Mura, about the 312 people. About what you do with guilt when the thing that produced it can't be undone. He was aware, as he spoke, that he was giving a Vithari military official information that was, technically, personal and therefore potentially exploitable. He was also aware that this didn't concern him much, because the information he was giving was not about weakness. It was about what humans did with weakness, and that was a different thing entirely. Ivvareth said, "You turn it into work." Jerome said, "Yes." "That is very human," Ivvareth said, and then in Vithari, which Jerome understood, "that is also very practical." It was the closest to a compliment the Vithari had given him in 12 years of war. He filed it appropriately. This conversation did not end the war. The war did not end because of any one conversation or any one engagement or any one decision. It ended the way it had been fought, in pieces, incrementally, through the accumulation of small changes that produced, eventually, a large change. Ivvareth's report to the Queen was one of those small changes. Jerome's analysis was one. The Veth operation was one. Callan's refusal to abandon the home sector, year after year, for 17 years, was not one small change but 17 small changes compounded into a fact. The fact that the home sector was still defended, and therefore still existed to be restored. What the Queen said to her council, "They cannot be made to want the wrong things," was the summary of what all those changes had accumulated into. It was a 4,000-year empire, understanding something it had never needed to understand before. That there are beings in the galaxy for whom the offer of everything is less powerful than the memory of a specific piece of ground, and the image of a man standing on it with one hand on a machine, not running, watching the ships come, deciding that figuring out what they want is where you start. You cannot negotiate away that kind of memory. You cannot replace it. You cannot offer something better because better is not the relevant category. The relevant category is it what was taken? And if it isn't, then it isn't enough, and the being who holds that memory will continue, patiently, in the particular way that things continue when they have been maintained with care, until they get back what was taken or there is nothing left to continue with. The Vithari had never understood this because they had never needed to. They were correct that the integration of other species into the convergence was, on balance, beneficial to those species. The data supported this, across 31 prior integrations. What the data had never encountered was a species for whom the on balance was beside the point, for whom the specific, irreplaceable, particular thing outweighed any calculation, for whom a battered mechanical hauler standing in a field waiting to be needed was worth 17 years of war. Jerome Rowe watched the restoration of Holmes' world from orbit for 3 days before the shuttle descended. He wanted to see it from above first, to know the shape of it again. The coastlines and the plateau and the agricultural valleys, and in the long evening light of the secondary sun, the eastern fields, amber-brown, the color of old leather, the color of the photograph in Callan's jacket. He remembered standing in those fields at 12 years old, following the hauler through the rows while his father explained to him how the soil worked. Not the chemistry of it. Iran Rowe was not a chemistry teacher, but the feel of it, how it held water, how it released it, how you could tell by looking at the surface what was happening 2 feet down, how the smell after rain was different from the smell before it, and what each meant. He had not thought of himself as learning anything at the time. He had thought of himself as following his father around, which was what 12-year-olds do. It was only later, much later, in the cargo bay of a refugee transport, reading maintenance logs by the light of the hauler's sensor array, that he understood he had been learning something. He had been learning how to pay attention to a specific thing, in a specific place over time, in a way that made you responsible for it. That was what his father had been teaching, not farming, responsibility. The specific, named, irreplaceable responsibility for a specific, named, irreplaceable piece of ground and what lived in it. He thought, I'm going to need seeds. It was an absurdly practical thought. He almost laughed at it. The war was over. The treaty was signed. The queen of a 4,000-year empire had offered him anything in the galaxy, and his brother had asked for a farm, which was the right answer, which Jerome had known was the right answer the moment Callan had described it on the comm call from the transit ship. But the farm was going to need seeds, and the particular heritage varieties his father had grown were probably not available in a standard catalog, and he was going to have to find them. He added that to the list of things to do. The list was long. He was 36 years old and healthy, and had approximately 40 years of work ahead of him, which was, by his estimation, about the right amount of time. The shuttle descended through the atmosphere of Holmes' world in the early evening, when the secondary sun was still up, and the light was doing what it did going through gold, then amber, then something deeper. He watched it through the viewport the whole way down. When the landing struts touched the ground and the hatch opened and the smell came in, the iron-rich smell, the alive smell, the smell that meant something was working down there in the dark, he stood in the hatchway for a moment and breathed it. Then he went to the cargo bay and lowered the ramp in the hauler, patient as it had always been, walked itself down and onto the ground of its world and stopped. Jerome stood next to it. He put his hand on the chassis. The evening light came over them both, warm and amber brown, the light his father had loved for the specific way it made the fields look. Not golden, not dramatic, just honestly lit, the color of things that have been worked and are being worked still, the color of effort that is ongoing and has not yet reached its end. The hauler's sensor array emitted a brief, low-frequency pulse that its specification manual did not document, and that Jerome had added in the third year of the war as a kind of check-in signal. A way of the machine communicating, I am here, I am running, I am ready. He had added it because his father used to say good morning to it. Some things you continue, because you are the kind of person who continues. He said, we're home. The hauler didn't respond, because it was a machine and machines do not respond to that kind of statement. But it was running, and it was standing on its ground, and the soil beneath its treads was beginning, very slowly, in the patient way of things that have been waiting to receive it. Above them, the secondary sun finished its arc and the stars came out, one by one, over the eastern fields of Holmes' world, over the ground that had been taken and given back, over the place where a marker would be set in the morning to say, here is where it ends, and here is where it begins again.